Good afternoon and welcome to the Bee Yard. The fall rains have finally started after a long, hot and dry summer here in Michigan. And with the rains have come the fall flowers. The bees are busily at work taking advantage of summer's last hurrah. They seem almost frantic in their coming and going. They know there are only a few weeks left before settling into a long Michigan winter. As things wind down in the bee yard, we now have more time to spend in the workshop, tending to all of those long overdue projects. And that is a good thing, since time spent in the workshop is quality time. One project that a beekeeper should definitely put on their list is building their own beehive. It is not complicated. I can think of no better way to expand and extend your beekeeping journey than building your own equipment. Building your own beehive is easy on your budget, and you will end up with first-class stuff. In this series of videos, we will show you how to build a beehive, from the hive stand at the bottom to the telescoping cover at the top, and everything in between. It is a great winter project. So join us as we learn how to build a beehive in the beekeeper's workshop. Today's project, building the inner cover. Spring has sprung here in Michigan, and it's time we complete the beehive project we started last fall. This is always a busy time of year here in the bee yard, but we need to get back to the workshop and complete our beehives. We will be needing them in the very near future. So let's get started on the hive's inner cover. In a beehive, the inner cover sits on top of the hive bodies and just below the top cover. The inner cover is the interior ceiling of the hive. There are 3 different widths for the inner cover, depending if you are using 10-frame, 8-frame, or 5-frame equipment. The downloadable plans for this project contain the dimensions for all 3 sizes. The website for these plans will be provided at the end of this video. You may have wondered what's the purpose of an inner cover. I know I have. Well, working the hive is certainly easier with an inner cover, since the top cover won't be glued to the hive bodies with propolis. The inner cover will, but this can be pried off with your hive tool. So I suppose this is one reason for the inner cover. The inner cover can also provide a bit more space for the bees to move about the frames in the top super, so maybe this is a second purpose. And as we shall see, the inner cover can also be used to promote ventilation in the hive, which is very important. And finally, the vent can be fitted with a bee escape and used to clear the bees out of the honey supers. When used in this manner, the inner cover is sometimes referred to as an escape board. However, there are other and perhaps better ways to make an escape board. The inner cover consists of a 1.5-inch wide frame with a ledge on the inside. A cover piece sits on this ledge. In the middle of the cover piece is a hole for high ventilation. This feature is very important. The cover isn't really structural, so it can be made out of relatively thin plywood or hardboard. Many commercial covers nowadays are hardboard. The depth of the ledge is such that the top of the cover sits slightly below the top of the frame, about 1/4 inch or so. You will end up with a depth of about 3/8 inch on the other side. This feature allows you to control the space above the frames in the top super by simply flipping the inner cover over 1/4 inch one way and 3/8 inch the other. However, I don't find this detail particularly important, so if your cover piece ends up flush with the top of the frame or slightly below, then that will be okay. In today's project, I will be building an inner cover for an 8-frame hive, because that's what I use in my bee yard. We will make the frame out of a 1x4 pine. For the cover insert, I will use 1/8-inch luan, a type of plywood. The overall size of the inner cover for 8-frame equipment is 19 7/8 inches long and 13 3/4 inches wide, or the same size as the footprint of the hive body. For the corners, we'll be using a rebate joint. This type of joint minimizes exposed end grain, which is always a good thing, and keeps the ledge entirely in the center of the frame. We will cover the details of making the rebate joint a bit later. For the frame, we will need two side members 18 3/8 inches long and two end members 13 3/4 inches long. Since the width of the frame is 1 1/2 inch, we can cut a 1x4 to the lengths needed and then rip the two boards to the 1 1/2 inch width. So the first thing we need to do is cut from a 1x4 a board 18 3/8 inches long and then another 13 3/4 inches long. Now it is a simple matter of ripping these boards to width. At the table saw, I have moved the fence 1 1/2 inches from the inside of the blade. When done, we will have two boards 18 3/8 inches long and two boards 13 3/4 inches long, each 1 1/2 inch wide. On the inside edge of the frame, we need a ledge, or a rabbet, that is 3/4 inches wide and 3/8 inches deep. For the shoulder cut of the rabbet, move the fence 3/8 of an inch from the inside of the blade, and then raise the blade 3/4 of an inch. Run a frame member through on edge. Make the same cut on all four pieces of the frame. For the cheek cut of the rabbet, I have moved the fence to 3/4 of an inch to the inside of the blade, and then lowered the blade to 3/8 of an inch. Notice that the waste pieces we are removing are on the outside of the blade to prevent a kickback, so make sure you have the boards oriented correctly. And here's what the frame will look like when you are done. Now let's turn our attention to making a rebate joint for the corners of the frame. To make the rebate joint, remove 1.5 inches from the ledge formed by the rabbet from each end of the two end members of the frame. Making this cutout on the rabbet is fairly easy to do. I use a table saw because I end up with tight-fitting joints. So I'll show you that first. Then I'll quickly go through 4 additional ways to make the cutout of the rebate joint. For the shoulder cut, I used the tenon jig. The blade is raised 1.5 inches and the fence is moved to 3/4 of an inch to the inside of the blade. Notice that I am using a scrap 1x4 as a backstop to clamp the frame to the tenon jig. Now it is just a matter of running it through. To complete the cutout, I removed the tenon jig, set the fence 1.5 inches to the outside of the blade, and then lowered the blade to 3/4 of an inch. Once the saw is set up, completing the cutouts is quick, easy, and accurate. Now for some alternatives. Of course, you can always make the cutout by hand, or use a jigsaw, or nibble away using a set of dado blades, or use a band saw. Simply do whatever works best for you. The cover insert sits on a ledge on the inside of the frame. For 8-frame equipment, this cover will be 18 3/8 inches long and 12 1/4 inches wide. I'm using 1/8 inch Luan, which is sold in 4 foot by 8 foot sheets. You probably will be able to buy the stuff in half sheets. Luan is metric, so the thickness is a bit more than 1/8 of an inch. You can also use 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch hardboard or tempered masonite. Which material you use, hardboard or Luan, is a personal choice. I'm not sure it really makes a difference, and one doesn't seem to last that much longer than the other. When cutting the cover from a large sheet of material, I like to make the rough cut a bit oversized, and then trim to the exact length and width on the table saw. This way, the edges of the cover will be straight and there will be a better fit in the frame. In the middle of the cover is an oblong hole for the vent. In commercial equipment, this vent is 1 1/8 inches wide and 3 3/4 inches long. Note that the ends of the vent are rounded. This detail is relevant because commercially available bee escapes are made to fit into this size and shape. However, if you don't intend to use a bee escape, then the size and shape of the vent is not particularly important. I'll show you 3 different ways to make a vent. One uses a jigsaw and the other 2 use a router. In commercial equipment, the vent is oriented lengthwise to the inner cover. I know some manufacturers who cut the vent in the opposite direction because they feel having the vent crosswise to the frames improves ventilation. The choice is yours. I'm going with a lengthwise orientation. When using a jigsaw, the first step is to mark out the vent hole. Remember, the standard vent opening is 3 3/4 inches long, 1 1/8 inches wide, with 2 half circles rounding out each end. Next, we need to drill a pilot hole. I'm using a 3/4 inch paddle bit, although just about any bit big enough for the saw's blade is okay. Finally, we carefully cut out the vent, splitting the trace line in half. You will probably need to clean up the edges with a bit of sandpaper. In my shop, I make the vent holes with a router. My advice is to make a template beforehand with the vent already cut out and positioned where you want it. Once the template is made, you can quickly make the vent on the cover insert that is an exact duplicate of the template. Using the template, the vent can be cut freehand with a router or on a router table if you have one. The trick is using a patterning bit in the router. A patterning bit is a straight router bit that has a bearing which exactly matches the diameter of the cutter. The bearing follows the inside edge of the template's cutout, while the cutter removes the material from the hole in the cover insert. It works really slick. Patterning bits are available with the bearing at the top by the shank or on the bottom of the bit. Which one you use depends whether or not you are routing from the top from the template or from the bottom. When cutting freehand from the top, you will want a bit with the bearing on the top. When using a router table and cutting from the bottom, you will want a bit with the bearing on the bottom of the bit. When using the router, you will need to keep the template securely attached to the cover insert. I use a couple of strips of double-sided carpet tape. It does a good job, and the template is easily separated from the cover insert after you are done. Now we can drill a starter hole for the router bit. At the router table, we slip this whole affair, template side up, over the router bit. Adjust the height of the bit so that the bearing rides on the template and the cutter removes the material from the cover insert. And just follow the template to cut the vent opening. Nothing to it. If you are cutting the vent hole freehand, use some clamps to hold the template to the cover insert. The clamps lift the material high enough so the router bit doesn't dig into the table, and follow the template, just like we did before. So there you have 3 different ways of making the inner covers vent. You might even think of more, so use whatever works for you. We can now assemble the inner cover. Start by dry fitting the pieces together. Make sure the cover insert fits on the frame's ledge without forcing the corner joints apart. Spread an even coat of glue on each corner. Then nail the frame together, checking for square. I'm using 1 3/4 inch brads. Next, lay in a bead of glue on the rabbet and spread evenly with a glue brush or your finger. And then install the cover. You can clamp the cover until the glue dries, but I find it easier to use 1/2-inch staples along the edges of the cover. For extra credit, you may want to consider making a small opening or dado across the end of the inner cover's frame. This opening can serve as an extra vent for getting moisture out of the beehive, and that is a good thing. This opening can also serve as a hive top opening for the coming and going of the bees, and that too is a good thing. Simply cut a 3/8 inch deep notch, an inch or so wide, centered on the end of the frame. A set of dado blades makes short work of this job. I'm using the radial arm saw, but you can easily make this same cut on the table saw. When used on a hive, make sure the telescoping top cover is pushed forward so as not to block this opening. Now it is time to paint the inner cover. As always, I suggest you use a primer and 2 top coats. The inner cover will collect a lot of moisture from condensation within the hive, particularly during the winter. So I highly recommend that you paint both sides of the inner cover, paying special attention to the inside of the vent opening. Hardboard and Luan don't stand up to moisture very well, and the better paint job you do, the longer the inner cover will last. The inner cover is done and just in time. The end of winter has come, and the bees are eagerly working our first spring pollen sources. In our next video, we'll show you how to make the hive's telescoping top cover. Looking forward to seeing you again in the Beekeeper's Workshop.